It's been really interesting lately, and I am, for some reason, I am incapable of actually recording my videos and having the sound on key with my videos better than Nova. um, so I am not sure what's going on. I'm not happy, but I tried to record a video for like 2 hours this morning and it did not work at any point of time. So I am a little bit frustrated with that, but I figured I'd come in and do the live instead. I'm over on YouTube as well. And I'm going to just, touch on a couple of subjects that we've touched on before, and see where we can go with that. Yeah. I don't know. I think I'm probably a little bit preoccupied right now with some of the stuff that I see coming across, and some of the things that I'm really finding problematic. Hey guys. And so, like, I don't know. I'm like somebody out there trying to tell everybody that Nordic practices are closed practices because Norse paganism is a closed paganism and it's indigenous, and it's like, fuck off. No, it's not. Sami are indigenous, the Norse aren't. Then, we've got the lateral violence where, people who are not white are really upholding white supremacist talking points and white supremacist ideas, and all the attacking going on, and all the other stuff going on. And so I guess my mind just gets a little preoccupied. I have a hard time sleeping. It's fucked up. And I don't want to have a hard time sleeping over TikTok. The last thing I want to do is have a hard time sleeping over TikTok. I have enough of a hard time sleeping over enough fucking reasons as it is to have, a hard time speaking over TikTok, or sleeping over TikTok. And I've tried to do a couple of videos lately, and each time I've tried to do a video, like, it has delayed the sound in my video. So it's off, which is so annoying for me, and I know it's annoying for other people. But my brain won't let me watch it without being frustrated with it, right? So I'm like, fuck, I can't do that. And so I'm trying to figure out, how to get downloaded and re-downloaded and, force stopped and fucking everything else I can do to try and get TikTok to actually record. So I don't know. And it's not that big of a deal in the long run. Sometimes my brain is like, why can't we all just get along? And it's like, oh my God. Well, and not just using the Nordic and Celtic identities to excuse appropriation of indigenous sacred marks. That's not even what I'm talking about now. There is can't be more than 20 something little girl on TikTok telling people that Norse paganism is a closed practice because the Norse are an indigenous group, and she is always going to support indigenous practices being closed practices. And I'm like, first of all, the Norse aren't fucking the indigenous group. The Sami are. Like, I see where your problem is. You think that this group's indigenous when it's fucking not. It's not an indigenous group. They are, in fact, the colonizers of this specific area. They're not indigenous to Scandinavia. They're Germanic people who are indigenous to Germanic regions, who colonized and put Sami on reservations and did, it's like, oh my God, are you fucking kidding me? Like, no, sweetheart. And who you are as somebody who is half my age, obviously, in the United States, from accent and conversation, like, not conversation I've had, but like through the videos, you can tell through the language and the accents from the United States, to tell people that Nordic practices are closed practices, the audacity of that in and of itself is like, so to be a part of a closed practice, you have to be a part of a community. It has to be an indigenous community that has been there, that has maintained practices. And it can be outside of where it's supposed to be, like the Sami are displaced, and many indigenous tribes or nations of the North America or South America are displaced, right? So you can be displaced, but you have to still have community. You have to still have maintained some sense of indigeneity to open or close a practice. You have to have been able, like, I have no problem with the Irish having close practices. The Irish have been there, and many of them have maintained their indigeneity. There are people who were burned and murdered for maintaining their indigeneity. There are people that hid practices for decades and hundreds of 1,000 years, quite literally, actually, if you think about it, for about 1,400 years, there are people in Ireland who have been hiding their practices to continue on those practices. If somebody in Ireland decides to tell people that's a close practice, good on you. 100% support. If an Irish descendant in the United States decides to tell you that something is a closed practice because it's Irish, fuck off. Quite roundly, quite hugely, right? No. If Sleepy wants to tell you that something is closed, Cumraig. Is it Cumraig when it is the peoples, or is it Cumri still? See, I don't know enough to tell you what's open and closed. Through my DNA research, I can tell I have Welsh ancestry. I might get into my Cymru history and practice some forms of faith within that. But here in the United States, I don't have the right to tell jack shit anyone what is opened or closed about a European indigenous group unless I have come from that European indigenous group to the United States directly. Like, I have friends who are Sami, who live a couple hundred miles from me, who I have stood front lines with, right? If they, here in the United States, I mean, they're Pita Sami, they're like 50 members of their group left, right? They're, have carried on their tradition and carried on their language for generations, right? And his family is from there. He comes from there. If he wants to tell somebody here, this is Sami close practice, okay. You are practicing something that you learned in Sweden from your people, right? So you have the right to state that that is close practice. To my knowledge, not even most people within Scandinavia are practicing Norse paganism. To my knowledge, there's many reconnecting to it. There's many seeking out their ancestry, right? But as a group that has stayed and held on to these practices and has been fighting against a colonization that didn't happen, Christian colonization absolutely colonizes the understanding of Christianity. It absolutely takes away the animistic practices of a region. But Christian colonization is not the colonization of colonization, because it is a colonization of the mind, not of the physicality. When you have a king who is converted to Christianity, and that converted to Christianity king enforces Christianity on his people, this is not an outside government colonizing a space. It is your government deciding to change your faith. Henry VIII didn't colonize England when he took them from the Catholic Church to the Protestant Church. That was not the colonization of Britain. The colonization of Britain happened with the Anglo-Saxons, with the Norse. Colonization of Britain did not happen with the Scandinavians, not the Norse, did not happen from Henry VIII, right? So that is not a colonization. That is a colonization of Christian thoughts, but it is not a colonization of space, right? It removes animism in that space, absolutely. It is problematic in that space, absolutely. But whereas the Irish were still practicing their traditional animistic faiths, and the English and I'm going to use actually English here because by that point it was the English specifically, and the English come in and colonize and bring their Christianity with them and literally put their people in charge of different tracts of land and turn the Irish people into pre-chattel slavery. That's colonization. It is not colonization when your king or queen converts and then makes you convert. Maybe a colonization of your mind, but it is not a colonization of you. It is not a colonization of your home. And it does not see, colonization creates a space where you have an indigenous group and an outside group. You cannot be the group that's there that's already been colonizing, let's be real, and change from Christianity. And that creates those two distinct indigenous versus non-indigenous groups within a single group, right? I.e., an example, if you are a Germanic descent people who have moved into Latvia and have, pushed out pretty much everybody else, right? And then your group converts to Christianity, you are not colonizing Latvia. You are not moving into Latvia. You are not displacing the people in Latvia. You are the people of Latvia. So you are not going to have reservations because, the Sami live on the equivalent of reservations. The people in the United States and Canada live in reservations, and I specify United States and Canada because it is those governments that enact those reservations. You are not taking Latvian people and putting them in a specific space, and this group gets to maintain its specific indigeneity while this rest of the group becomes Christian. That's not what happens. The English colonized the Welsh, the Cymry, which absolutely is a colonization, and then they Christianize. They start Christianizing as English before they start colonizing Wales. So it is a colonization of Christians, like here in the US, right? And this is true. When indigenous people come home or move around on their own land, they're not immigrants. This is true. That's the other argument that I've been in recently. Fuck off. The weird. I'm putting myself out there, so might as well. Anyways, it is not colonizing when you convert. When your government converts to a new religion, it's not being colonized. You are not being colonized. You are not being marginalized. Your faith might be marginalized, but you as a people are not marginalized. Scandinavians have a beautiful cultural heritage that is Germanic root. And for the lower part of the Scandinavian regions, for the upper part of the mainland continent, this is absolutely space that is indigenous for them. The Sami are the indigenous people of Scandinavia. So do not claim on any level that the Scandinavian people are a closed practice because they're an indigenous group and you're going to defend indigenous groups' rights to closed practice. It's just unacceptable. You're detracting from the fact that there are indigenous groups in Scandinavia fighting for their rights, right? You are deciding that the colonizers of those people are instead the people that need to be, what do you mean NVOA? Sorry, I don't understand that one. But to decide that the Norse are the indigenous people that need to be protected when they are in fact the colonizers of another indigenous group that needs to be protected and is searching for protection is um, quite frankly immoral. Quite frankly, using marginalized people's needs to marginalize yourself so that you can shut people up instead of learning, and problematic because of that. And quite frankly, devalues the struggle of everybody involved in those needs. They're not stones. One second. And really, truly, that is a colonizing, very Christian white mindset to decide that a group is indigenous that is not, and to decide that you, from a complete diaspora that has no connection to that group, even if they were still living in that space as indigenous people, are the one to decide what close practice is. That is very Christian. That is very colonizer mindset. It is very much not Nordic paganism. It is very much not animism. So that, thank you. That's awesome. And that for me is where I'm just like, fuck off. Not only that, but like they're a 20-year-old something. I mean, I can't think of them as any more than 30 looking at their face. So these are actually, so I believe they're recreations is what he told me. My father, my biological father, who I found in 2020, he's been setting up lodges for people at Sundances and in different communities for roughly 30 years, 40 years. He's spent most of his life doing that. So he belongs to a lot of groups. Not only does he do that and move within those communities doing that, and within indigenous communities doing that, but he also belongs to different groups of like reenactors and stuff like that, because he'll set up a lodge and he'll teach or show different things. He gets given a lot of like jewelry things or a lot of beadwork stuff. He does a lot of leather work and a lot of beadwork. And so when I was there for my brother's funeral, I grabbed these and something for one of my daughters to make jewelry. But this I kind of have been using. I grabbed them and I was like, well, I'm just going to kind of use these as prayer beads, right? Because they're very much that that feeling. He says that he knows a couple of women who recreate and make traditional beads and or early trade beads. And I know I've done this myself. Like this I made when I was 12. My mother and my sister and I made these. And these are copper lined. You can't really see it so much because they're on a piece of leather because I use it to tie back my hair. But these are copper lined glass beads. And this is how the early trade beads were and what they looked like, some of them. Some of them were, so they would take glass and they would make long tubes of glass and then they would break them to make beads. And just different ways. So there are people who I'm not sure if this is where he got it. I'm assuming that he got it from a Mountain Man reenactment group that goes out and tries to recreate and study, what happened with the white settlers of the gold rush, basically, and the early fur trappers or fur traders and stuff. And so it's a very mixed community usually, and it is a very educational community. It's very much about teaching and about educating. And so I believe that one of the women who, because he said and I believe he said that she actually she makes one of the skills that she has learned is how to make glass beads, and these are some of the beads that she's made. And so I'm using it as a fidget. I've been using it as a fidget. I haven't used it in a few days, but I use it as a fidget. I was using that in my brother's Snuggie. I had a panic attack and kind of lost my father and I don't know each other, and we're two very contrary individuals who know everything. So it was I got this like my first full day there to just kind of calm me and give me something that I could hold when I needed it. This he gave me like I think the day before the funeral, or I grabbed it the day before the funeral, and then so I put this in my brother's coffin at the funeral. But I spent the rest of my time just keeping it with me to just kind of hold, to keep myself calm because I hadn't taken anything with me to keep myself calm, not thinking that I was going to have massive panic attacks over and over again. So they're my kind of safe zones, safety nets. I'm throwing my brother around. So that's what these are. They're a recreation of trade beads, of early trade beads. So for me, stuff like that, stuff like some 20-something-year-old deciding to go out and tell the Norse pagans in the United States what is closed and open practice, as if they have the Scandinavian heritage to decide A, or Scandinavian communal connection to decide A, or as if Scandinavians were the indigenous group of Scandinavia. Really, to me is a huge sense of audacity. This is that indoctrination and that teaching that one has the right to dictate and to control of others. Things that one is not in keeping of. I don't want to say possession of, because possession I don't think is it. I believe that culture keepers have the right to dictate what is and what is not open and closed practice for indigenous groups who are indigenous groups. We ask them, unless you belong to our culture and are given it within our culture, you do not use it. This is respect, right? Anybody who is seeking to practice ancestral worship should be really working towards respecting others as well. Anybody who claims to be Nordic paganism should be really working towards being honorable first and foremost, because honor is a huge thing among Nordic peoples. Again, Nordic peoples are actually Scandinavian peoples. Scandinavian peoples are actually descendant of Germanic peoples. And there is a huge sense of honor among the deities that you see. There's a huge sense of the show of honor and the show of what is dishonorable too, right? So if there is an indigenous group maintaining and or reconnecting to their culture in the region of their culture, I guess is the best way to put it. You don't have to be in the space that you were in initially. We see that many people have been displaced. Many times those displacements are not completely out of their space. Some indigenous groups have always been traveling and have always been displaced. The Judaic people are an indigenous group. The Romani people are an indigenous group. These are groups that have constantly been either displaced or constantly been traveling, and they have absolutely been identified as that group, even within that, and they absolutely have the right to say what is closed and what is not closed to them. Many of us have Romani heritage. That does not give us the right to dictate what is Romani open and closed practice. Now, if we have joined Romani groups, if we have talked to Romani culture keepers, if we have been a part of the Romani group in reconnection, if we have heard from Romani culture keepers, elders, people who know, what is closed and open practice, then we can say that's not exciting, that's a closed practice. I was taught by this person that that's a closed practice. To be an individual that does not belong to a indigenous community in a diaspora that is legendary for not knowing what the fuck it's doing anyways, and decide to tell people across the globe what is closed and open practice to something that you are not actually really a part of, is audacity. And that is absolutely that Western thought. That is absolutely that indoctrination of that narcissistic thought process that centers you as the be all and end all of everything. We are never the center anywhere except our own fucking heads. And the main character syndrome really needs to stop. It's not even healthy. It's really not. We have always been centric to community instead of self until we were Christianized or colonized by Western thought that created self-centric thought out of animistic communal behavior. Again, I have to always take it back. It seems like, that really goes back to the idea of somebody being a king, that stratification of society, that ability to control you, that main character syndrome, right? This is 100% the indoctrination within the society that we see within Western thought. And I specify Western thought because that is something that you see in Western thought across the globe. It doubles down here in the US. The US becomes so unique in the fact that it is founded, the United States, on colonialism and founded on racism, right? Founded on othering. And because it is a space where people come in and colonize, where they haven't been able to have interaction with for at least 1,000 years by that point, or, a couple thousand years really. And really ignorant people coming in because they didn't know this existed, though, their ancestors knew it existed, right? So people coming in and taking over space, causing really the first genocide, starting really the first genocide of one group of people, the enslavement and transportation and disconnect of another group of people, and then encouraging groups of people from all over the world to come in, creates a uniqueness of culture. Because the United States is only in effect for a couple of hundred years as the government that it is and the understanding as a country as it is, when it really turns to the industrial age and capitalism, right? You see that there's no foundation of history and understanding of care for your people to stop that capitalism from becoming something that devours everybody, right? In a unique way, which is that plasticity, that plastic culture that we see in the United States, that disposal culture, everything's easy to dispose of, everything should be on demand. Your phone's supposed to give out in a year, that culture that says that everything is supposed to be gotten rid of anyways, right? That discard culture comes from not having a historical heritage of upholding your people, and instead the historical heritage of the government being destroying people. And then the start of the industrial age, the start of the capitalistic age, really corresponding with that, right? And so whereas other nations have this need already there to really maintain their people, right? So this is why, Christian colonization or the colonization of Christian thought within Scandinavia is not the colonization of Christianity within the United States, right? Because when a king converts and then converts his people, he's not trying to kill his people as he's converting them. Whereas when the Christians come in and start colonizing the United States, they're killing everybody along the way, right? So you see that in these countries that have maintained their heritage, that disposal of their people is not quite as easy. Like, there are levels of stratification, there are levels of disposal, there are levels of racism, there are levels of all of these issues within them still. They are not founded on those issues. And they are not founded on destruction. More often, they are founded on some form of unification, some form of change in thought process, or the spread of the Romans, right? Spread of the Romans really did a whole lot. Or, like, there are places in Asia that have been there for 5,000 years, like continuous cultures, right? Or they're founded on their history, right? They're founded on, uniting as an early people. This really means that it's not unusual for us to have people saying shit like, I get to decide what's closed and open practice for a different country's people. Or I get to close the borders and decide that immigrants from south of the Mexican-American border or Mexican-U.S. border aren't welcome, even though, they've been there for hundreds of thousands of years, and I've only been here for a hot minute. Thousands of years is better. This is where we get people who think it's okay to uphold white supremacist thought process and erase groups of people and help people commit genocide. This all ties in to the fact that we have deified that main character complex. We have deified that narcissistic thought process. And that Western thought, starting with the initial stratification of society, worship me, I'm the God King, starting within that and then translating down into a religious belief. Again, that starts with religion anyways. It starts with the idea that somebody is important enough to be a god. And then it moves into this, everybody's important enough to be a god, right? And that's what Christianity does. It's like, there's one God, but he lives in every single one of you. So we're all God, and we're all chosen by God if we choose God. And this is just a gift he gave us, so we can destroy it, right? Again, that is that main character complex. That is, this is a gift I was given to destroy. It's not that the tree has been here for 200 fucking years and I'll be here for 80. And therefore, maybe I should respect that I'm a child compared to that tree, right? It is, that tree is there for me to cut down and do what I want with it because God made me and God gave that to me as a gift, right? So that centralizes self as the main character and everything else is NPC. Everything else is exploitation. And with that center of self, then centering everything else is the ability to exploit, we run into things like this. We run into people of color using white supremacist tactics to erase other people of color, or using white supremacy tactics to really just decide to uplift themselves instead of uplifting community. We see where people decide that, because they read a couple of books, maybe, that they know everything and they get to dictate for the rest of the world. We see people who think that, and this is a problem that I have had, that I had to grow out of. Everything I know today is what I know today. tomorrow some new information is going to come and it might change my whole fucking worldview. In my career, especially because my career, my focus of paleoanthropology tells me that, right now fucking shit's popping up all the time, change our entire worldview, right? So until you have reached a point of understanding that I know this today doesn't mean this is absolute, can't be overturned fact. It might be fact today. It might be truth today. A and B, and this was a hard one for me. Close your mouth and learn to listen and let other people educate you on what should be done, said, behavior, so that you are moving properly within different communities to not cause harm, right? The not cause harm was never an issue for me. I always tried to not cause harm, but the lack of understanding was an issue for a long time, right? Especially in my 20s. The lack of understanding where even the positive things that I was trying to do could be negative in result, right? That just because I thought that it was a positive idea doesn't mean that it was a positive idea and that it could in fact really be negative in result. And it's better to actually, maybe hear from a couple other people first. And I mean, even today, I know that, and I've said many times in here, the information I have today may change tomorrow, and it might be a whole different set. We might have a whole different thing. This is the knowledge for today. This is what today says. When you are trying to reconnect with your ancestors, and this goes to things like paganism, which is animism, right? Intent versus impact, yes, is huge. This goes to things like paganism and animism. When you are attempting to reconnect to your ancestral thought process, you have to really dig into what is and what is not the colonized Western thought process in your head, right? So telling people that something is a closed practice when you're not a culture keeper and you don't come from a culture that has culture keepers and hasn't been able to maintain that, indigeneity. When you have not been told this by a culture keeper from that group, right? Telling the whole world that something is a closed practice because you decided it was a closed practice really leans into that control, to that I get to decide, and to that main character's thought process, right? These are all Western thought processes. So to truly become pagan or animistic, you have to understand that those behaviors are not, and therefore you need to ditch them to really reconnect. Now, again, there are plenty of people who have the right to say that something is a closed practice. They belong to the community that closes those practices. These are groups that have been here and maintained connection and maintained practice and understanding and knowledge, right? And they're indigenous, which Nordic paganism is not indigenous, right? It's not Scandinavian indigenous, it's Germanic indigenous, which means it's indigenous to the upper half of Eurasia if it's or the upper western half of Eurasia if it's indigenous to anywhere, but it's certainly not indigenous to Scandinavia, right? Except for, again, that very lower portion of Scandinavia, which is really not even in the thing that people want to think of as Scandinavia, right? We really need to understand that if we are trying to reconnect, if we are trying to deconstruct, if we are trying to decolonize, then we really have to leave behind anything that states I have control over anybody else by my right, that I should, that anybody should, that's not the way to phrase it, that the things that I do don't affect anybody else. Meaning, if I have the right to life, then I have to defend your right to life so that you'll defend my right to life. That's responsibility to each other. So we believe that we have the right to something without a responsibility corresponding. And anything that works for self over community, anything that is working for self over community. Now, here's the thing. We're all going to fuck it up. We're all going to fuck it up 100 fucking times, 1,000 fucking times. It is about being willing to learn from the fuck up. It is about being willing to grow. That is a foundation of animism. That is a foundation of who we are as a people, as a species, is to be able to adapt our adaptations, learn more, grow, right? And I want to say, because, I do, we always should put community first. We should always be working for community before we're working for ourselves. That does not mean that you should ignore self-care or self-need. Unfortunately, we seem to think that working for community means that we are supposed to give up any self-care and any needs needed, right? I should never be putting somebody else's desires before my needs. That is not working for community. If my needs are not met, I am incapable of working towards community and uplifting community. So if your desire is to have all of the food and my need is to eat, then I need to meet my need before your desire. So I need to take what I need to eat. And if you want the rest, that's fine, right? If you want to be that greedy, that's fine. You must understand, though, that it is absolutely about my needs don't supersede anybody else's needs. My desires don't supersede anybody else's needs, right? That is care of community. You must absolutely ensure that you are caring for self, especially in today's age when most people don't understand community. And so if you're not caring for yourself and you are just caring for community, nobody is going to care back, right? So you definitely must take care of yourself. And that is something that we do not see enough of. And so that is something I want to double down on. Even in taking care of yourself, if you are putting your desires over other people's needs, you are not caring for community. You are not in an animistic practice. You are not in any pagan practice I know of. And I've studied several of them, right? Like I've looked into a lot of them, My personal practice is an eclectic mix of my ancestors, which are everywhere. So it's an eclectic mix. Right? Oh, this sings. Oh, that feels. That touches. Right? So I've studied many of them. And in none that I have seen is your need or your desire to supersede the community's need. That is not animistic. That is not communal. That is not pagan. Right? Pretty much every pagan sacrifice that we know of is done by people who choose to be sacrificed because they are putting the community's need above their own. Their need for life does not supersede the community's need for life. Many places, sacrifices must be willing, must be willing. If it is an unwilling sacrifice, it is dishonorable to the gods, and the gods will not be appeased. So many places you will see, similar to what we know of with some Celtic cultures, where somebody will be elected king or volunteer to be king. And at the end of the year or the end of the time period that they are king, thank you. At the end of the time period that they are king, they then are sacrificed. During the time period that they're king, they are not necessarily the leader of their group. Sometimes they're way more of a figurehead, but they enjoy all of the richness of life because they are offering themselves as a sacrifice. This is paganism. It is sacrificing for the need of the community. It is sacrificing for the need of the broader community of the biome. So when you center yourself as the be all end all, the giver of knowledge, the culture keeper, when you have not been invited by a culture to keep them. This is not animism, and it is not paganism. This really, when we look at that Western thought, we can see where that Western thought in its taking away of animism across the globe really carries that over into not just people, but into biome, right? And that's where Western agriculture coming in and causing destruction really comes in. We see that Western agriculture removes all the nutrients from a biome and replaces it with monoculture, or a singular culture, or a singular, well, in this case, a singular plant. So if I remove all the nutrients from the biome and replace it with a singular plant, that plant does not thrive. That plant does not grow. It doesn't have the nutrients it needs, because plants need not just the sun and the soil. The soil is because of all of the different things within the soil. All the different plants within the soil aerate the soil. They create a biome underneath the ground that you don't even see most of the time, that is full of different animals, little bugs, and gives off different chemicals that enrich the soil. And when we remove all of that and then plant a singular culture or a singular seed there, then what you are doing is depriving that singular seed of nutrients and depriving the biome around it of nutrients. What do I think of the left-hand path? I believe that what you mean by left-hand path is what would fall underneath the definition of paganism, because it is not one of the world's organized religions, but has a tendency to a lot of times it really translates as devil worship, or as following a line of negativity. Is this what you mean by the left-hand path? Something that is trying to follow an animistic or pagan line, self first. Okay, so and most people consider the left-hand path to be a pagan religion, correct? And is that why you would ask with that? To me, that is a Christian organization and a Christian faith. The reason, to me, that these are Christian faiths is anything that is a devil worshiping faith is absolutely 100% Christian based. The devil is seen in Christianity. The devil is a Christian God. It is not a God for anybody but Christianity, right? I don't even think it's in Judaism. I don't even think the devil exists in Judaism, to my knowledge. Shaitan, so the devil does exist in Islam, and is similar in Islam. Islam takes a lot of the Christian books, though, into the Quran, and it is based on it starts with the Torah, and then it takes some of the Christian books, and then it has some of the books of Muhammad, right? So Islam does have a devil, but that is because of the fact that it is basing on it is not a Christian religion, but it has Christianity in it, because it starts after Christianity and takes some of its founding principles from Christianity. And it does view Christ as a prophet and a Messiah, just not the Messiah. It views Muhammad as the Messiah or the prophet. So the devil not existing in any other space but Christian-based faith, it's a Christian religion. I don't consider it to fall under animism, or paganism. I consider it to fall under Christianity. The left-hand path, as in self first, but seeming to follow, many people will say Loki is a left-hand path. Coyote, spider, the trickster god. is a left-hand path. I am Lokian. Loki is not a left-hand path. Loki teaches honor. Loki teaches using intelligence to understand. And Loki teaches natural consequences for action, right? Really, in everything that you see in the interactions with Loki, you see that there is a consequence for the action, and Loki always stands up and is accountable for the consequences of the action, including changing into a mare and having carrying a horse and giving birth to Sleipnir, right? So Loki takes the consequences of his action. So I do not consider trickster gods to be the equivalent of negative or an evil. To me, and this probably comes because my understanding of the trickster is Coyote. And that was my first understanding of the trickster. But for me, trickster gods are the gods that can they use the natural consequences of the world to change your perception, right? They use the natural consequences of things around them to change your perception. Yeah, I don't think they're a left-hand path either. Many people will say that they are a left-hand path, though, or they will use like Loki and follow a left-hand path. Again, not Lokian. This is not animism and it's not paganism. It is Christianity appropriating another god, basically. It maintains the Christian thought process and appropriates another god. Following specific sense of self is not something that is natural to any species on this planet except for maybe snakes. Any species that has babies that they raise do not follow self, they follow community. Any species that is a social species that must have a group to live, from wolves to really any other thing. There are many species that are solitary, like bears are solitary. There's specific species. Snakes are solitary. Lizards are solitary. There are definitely species that are solitary, but any species that is not a solitary species, it is not natural to focus on self before everything else. We like to think it is because the church teaches us it is, right? Yeah, they have a big issue with the idea of harm thee none. I have a big issue with that. To me, anything that doesn't focus on not harming others is using that narcissistic God King idea, right? Using that dehumanization of others, right? Really, it's narcissistic. The left-hand path is very narcissistic. Anything that is very self-centric instead of communal-centric is very narcissistic. I do not view it as paganism, and I do not view it as animism. I do view it as a Christian perversion of paganism, a Christian perversion of animism. And, I will continue to state that Wicca and Widda is harm thee none. Bringing your Christianity left-hand path into it, that's your Christianity, right? I have been in periods in my life where I'm like, I'm not going to tell other people how to fucking practice, whatever. At the same point, for me, at this point in my life, I'm very much not capable of watching people claim something and twist it, especially when they're using Christian ideology or Western ideology to twist indigenous or animistic practices. It's just another method of that destruction, right? So when we're talking about agriculture and we're talking about Western agriculture, that destruction of the biome to plant, so it destroys the biome. And then we see in our very first cities that based on Western agriculture, Angazal is our first city that we see based on Western agriculture, and it destroys the biome in the valley that it's in within 300 years. But this is that ownership of land starting. This is that idea that I can own the earth, that I can own a piece of the earth. And with the idea that I can own a piece of the earth, we get this ability to dehumanize the earth, because the earth is as human as we are. It's a biome, it's a living, breathing thing, to deaden the earth, to make the earth non-existent as what it is. And that translates down to the ability to do it to animals, the ability to do it to humans. That translation down all roots back into that Western thought, narcissistic God king, the idea that there is a God, and that narcissistic head, not that there is a God, but the idea that there is this narcissistic head of state that is a child of a God, or is a God, right? That self-centric viewpoint that comes in, that does continue on into Christianity. So for me, we see that start of that idea that we shouldn't be living for community, or that we can center ourselves, when we see that start of dehumanization of everything around us, making anything around us less than having rights. Once we can make anything around us less than having rights, then we can take those rights from it, right? And when we do that, that is that start of that self-centric thought process. So to me, that is not animism. And it really ties into being, that deification of narcissism that we get through religion, and that deification of destruction that we get through religion. Widda is Peter Barriston Ellis wrote a book. He's an anthropologist and a linguistic anthropologist, or linguistic historian, who studies Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European, and Indo-European. And Widda is the oldest etymology of the word witch. Wid means feminism, or means knowledge. It's the last half of druid. And da means feminine. And it is a Celtic terminology. The Proto-Indo-European actually starts at the top of Turkey, or no, Turkey, India, and translates all across the western part of Eurasia. Finno-Ugric is all up in the northern part of Eurasia, both east and west, and the steppes in Siberia. Indo-European is the language that all the Celtic languages are, the Germanic languages, all the Latin languages, the Baltic languages all come from. And so in his trace of linguistics, he was able to trace that root word. They are this, and he's able to identify that the Widda and the Druid are the scientists, the educators, the educated class within the Celtic groups of people. So I use the term Widda as a title for scientist, basically, a title for anthropologist, basically. I also use Widda. It's my street name, like my code name, I guess. But I use it specifically for that. So the conflict between the church versus witches was absolutely a battle of the sexes. It's also a battle of faith, though. And we can't get rid of that, but it is absolutely a battle of faith. It is pushing down gender base, right? It's pushing down on a gender base. It does target the women and those of third genders or more genders, like anything that's not masculine. And this is in part because a lot of the education and a lot of the knowledge comes through a matrilineal. And so if you can target that, then you can destroy it. They do target the Druids early on too. So when Rome comes through, the Druids are considered wiped out before Rome gets there, or before Christianity gets there, before, because the Romans, like, they really worked to wipe out the Celtic Druids. And that wasn't a Christian thing. That was pre-Christianity. So by the time Christianity comes in, uh, those who are still practicing the old faith are considered witches. Um, and it is definitely something where you will see both genders dying. It is also something that you definitely see the old faith is very much carried on through women more than men. Do I know anything about the Black Irish religion that is supposedly driven out by St. Patrick? So, one second. Um, the Widda Ord site, under books, under the tab for books, there's a link to that book, Shayla. If you look on my profile, you'll see this, my website, nwiddaord.com. And under on that website is a books tab, and it has that book on there. It's the top book on there. So Black Irish is darker Irish. It's not African Irish, just to be understood. The Black Irish are, so we've talked before in here about the fact that the western part of Europe is settled by dark-skinned, light-eyed people. When these people are moving across, it takes time for them to become lighter, right? We've talked about that before. You know, we see 10,000 years ago, it's predominantly dark of skin. By 5,000 years ago, you're going to see that that light of skin and the dark of skin have kind of, switched the predomination of it. And then it's not until roughly 1,000 years ago that, or roughly at 1,000 years ago, you're still seeing roughly 10% of society in like Scandinavia being dark of skin. We absolutely also see that there are, like in the 700s, there's a grave of a child who is roughly 75, or well, she's 33% North African. And the rest of it is European, Northwest European. So we do see that there is that constant flow and that constant ebb. We do see that the original settlers of Ireland, to my understanding, are coming over from, again, that Proto-Indo-European comes over from the top of India, right? What is termed the Black Irish today, what was termed the Black Irish 1,000 years ago, were people who were relatively pale of skin, but had very dark curly hair and blue eyes. Sometimes you might see somebody who is a little bit darker of skin, but not significantly darker of skin. You do see that tightly coiled hair is something that's very prevalent in Ireland and Norwegian regions, or Scandinavian regions. I've said before, like I had an uncle who was Norwegian who had like a huge blonde afro naturally. I went to Job Corps with a kid with a huge blonde afro naturally, both Scandinavians. And there was a woman who sung with the Riverdance group in the 90s who had a huge red afro. So we do see that the tightly curled hair is often seen there as well, or tightly coiled hair is often seen there as well. But when they refer to Black Irish, what they are referring to is a little bit more swarthy, a little bit darker, maybe, and black hair. Generally, the Black Irish are smaller in stature too, to my knowledge, than, well, most Irish are kind of small in stature anyways. But when they are talking about Black Irish, the skin color might be slightly darker than mine, but roughly mine. Whereas most people in Ireland are like the color of paper, like there's that ultra light, right? And so, so there is also constant movement, right? We have to remember that there is never a point of time when Europe is stagnant, as in you're just in one space. Never, ever. Same thing with Africa. Same thing with Australia. Same thing with the Turtle Islands. Now, they're not necessarily mixing back and forth with most of Eurasia. They are mixing with Siberia, like they're going back and forth with Siberia. And again, that is a backward migration, not a forward migration. So they are taking their genetics back to Siberia over the Arctic Circle. But you are not seeing that people within Eurasia are ever stagnant, ever staying in one place. We see mummies on the Silk Road over in China that are redheads from Scotland. We see, mummies from Sweden. Like, we see this constant movement. The Tertium mummy, the Tertium Basin mummy, is considered to actually, the tattoos on that mummy are the same style of tattoos that are on the Russian steppes. They're the same style of tattoos that are seen in the Celts. And so, like, we think of this as one tattooing culture, but it's moving back and forth like this, right? So yes, there is possibility that you get people of African descent who are up in Ireland. There is possibility that you get people who are Spanish descent up in Ireland. To everything I know of the Black Irish are lighter of skin than what we would consider to be black, and have dark curly hair, though I don't remember hearing of somebody with like 4C dark curly hair. Like, I don't remember hearing of tightly coiled afro in somebody who's slightly darker of skin as a Black Irish. The descriptions that I've heard of as Black Irish, or the pictures that I've seen of the Black Irish, are generally light of skin with blue eyes and dark curly hair, and they're shorter. We do know, though, that Ireland, like I said, is settled from people who are coming up from, basically, out of the Levant area, out of the Middle East area, and coming up and going over, right? And that by the time they get to Ireland, all of these people are still very dark of skin. That dark skin is prevalent up until, God, I mean, we see that dark skin is prevalent within cultures at 7,000 years ago when some of them settled Scandinavia. Dark skin is very prevalent within cultures for a long, long, long time. So having darker skin and being Irish isn't going to be an indication of having recent African ancestry, or an indication of having recent, and the Spanish are light. Like, people are like, the Spaniards are not. The Spaniards are Caucasian, literally. That's a Caucasian region all along the Mediterranean basin. There is all Caucasian. Berengia, Berengia, the wife of Richard Coeur de Lion, was Spanish, and she was a blonde with blue eyes. Like, Spanish are light people. Spanish are Celtics, actually. Spanish are descendant of Celtic people. There's a Pictoni in the Iberian Peninsula. There's all of that space. That's all Celtic people. So the Spanish are actually light people. So yes, there is evidence that some people from the Spanish region who were Celts make it to Ireland, but that's in that migration over. There are later shipwrecks in Ireland of people who get stranded in Ireland, of Spanish people. But again, those Spanish people are light of skin. They're Spaniards. They're Celts. They're not really a different. They're a different tribe within a nation, right? So it's not something that we're seeing like sub-Saharan African being brought in, right? Or dark people being brought in. Anybody who is Spanish in the US who is dark of skin, is that because they're indigenous? Hispanics in the US who are dark of skin because they're indigenous. They're just colonized by the Spanish. Spanish are light. St. Patrick is roughly the 600s, if I remember correctly. St. Patrick is but I think he's in mainland. I think he starts in France, but I can't remember. It's a specific country within that region, and I can't remember what it is. And he's captured and taken as a slave to Ireland. Well, he's captured and then sold as a slave to Ireland. And he's a slave in Ireland. Some say he escapes, and then I'm not sure if he escapes or if he earns his freedom. And goes back to his homeland. And going back to his homeland, he learns Christianity, becomes Christian, and decides to take that Christianity back to Ireland. And he takes that Christianity to Ireland, and in taking that Christianity to Ireland, is said to drive out the last of the Druids. Basically, what it is driving out the. That's awesome. Some indigenous people call ourselves dark Irish on census so we could own land. That's really cool. When you see that, though, you see that Patrick at the time, he didn't drive out the Black Irish. There's no relation between Patrick and the Black Irish. There's only relation between Patrick and paganism. And St. Patrick drives out the paganism in Ireland, really is what they say. And he doesn't drive them all out, right? And there were never any snakes in Ireland to drive out. And the faith of St. Patrick is different than the Catholic faith 400 years later, when the Catholic Church actually takes over Ireland through the English. Early Catholic faith, priests are allowed to marry and have children. There's not as much of that double down as women are evil. And it really is trying to encompass a lot of the different faiths around, right? So this is why you see that that Christmas is based off of Saturnilla and the Celtic Yule and the Nordic Yule. So we see that Saturnilla is December 25th because that is the midwinter solstice for the Romans. And that when it translates out, we see that the tree itself is Celtic. And we see that the reindeer and Saint Nick are Nordic. And so we see that a lot of the translating out of Christianity at this time when Patrick is, converting Ireland is not the Catholic Church that we think of later on. Again, this is like 600. The church has only been a religion that is like in some sort of power for 200 years. Some of the emperors of Rome are converted, and while Christianity is a state religion within Rome, other religions are still being allowed within Rome, and not all of the emperors have converted, right? And so you see that there's still like to get that conversion to happen, they're making it easy for people to convert by not getting rid of their gods or their practices, right? By just incorporating their practices and appropriating their practices. So Patrick actually bringing Christianity to Ireland, first of all, he doesn't really drive out the pagans. Like the pagans are still kind of there for a while. And he doesn't bring the Christianity that we think of to Ireland. In 1000, Henry II, it's either Henry I or Henry II, and I can't remember off the top of my head, colonizes Ireland. And in his colonization of Ireland, the church participates in that colonization of Ireland. And at the time, the church, there's a faction within the church that thinks that priests should not be able to marry and that people should be celibate and that women should be, locked in, fucking lower levels and everything else, right? And there's a section in the church who's like, well, we're just going to continue the way we've been doing it because it's been working, right? And so Henry belongs to the section of the church that believes that priests should maintain celibacy and that women are lower. And so in Henry's colonization, conquering of Ireland, he brings that in with him. And you see that where most of the groups that were nominally Christian were actually still very pagan steeped, that gets wiped out. And so you get that change. No, the dark Irish weren't. The Irish were. The Druids were. So the dark Irish aren't a distinct group of Irish. The dark Irish are like in the same family as the light Irish. Like you'll have a redhead sibling and be dark Irish. You're not dark Irish because your parents are dark Irish. You're not black Irish because your parents are black Irish. You might be black Irish because one grandpa was black Irish, and then you had a couple of redheaded parents, and so you got two redheaded siblings and you, right? The black Irish are not a unique, separate group within Ireland at all. It's just red hair, basically. It's just somebody not, like you're a redhead, you're a blonde, or you're a blackhead, right? Like it's not a group. It's not an ethnicity. It's not a distinguishable anything. It's just a member of community, right? You're just an Irish person who's darker, right? So he's not driving out the black Irish. He's driving out the Druids. He's driving out paganism, but everybody's pagan. Everybody's pagan at this time. Everybody's animistic. It doesn't matter what color your hair is, right? And really, black Irish really only signifies the hair color. Really, really, really. You can be like paper white with black hair and blue eyes, and you're dark Irish or black Irish. That's really all it signifies. So it's not driving out any specific group. It's driving out paganism as a whole. And then you see that the actual drive out, the actual end of it all doesn't happen until 1000. I think it's like 1045, but I can't remember exactly, or 1046. Maybe it's 1035 with Henry. And that's that codification of church law that takes celibacy takes over and things like that. Yes, and that's like the pagan Brigid, the goddess of the hearth, gets translated into a goddess or a saint of the home, right? It's a fire goddess, hearth goddess. She's a fire saint, right? You see that. Saint Anne is another one. There's like several different saints that are actually Irish gods and goddesses. There's also several different saints that are Nordic gods and goddesses too that translate over. Absolutely, absolutely, Tamara. Yeah, and a lot of people, in the U.S. so much when we hear the word black, we just think that must be sub-Saharan African, and it's not. Okay? Like it doesn't always mean that. Black can mean many different things. Like many people in India are considered black, but they don't. You drop them in sub-Saharan Africa, and they wouldn't be considered sub-Saharan African, right? We have this, and it's really just because it's how we're taught, right? It's just because of the diaspora that we live in. But we see that, there's the Black Dutch as well. Now, some of the Black Dutch are actually like slave descendants. Like that's really what the Black Dutch is people who their ancestors were black slaves who were brought from Dutch settlements. So the Dutch were one of the first to free their slaves in Holland. They didn't free their slaves in outlying colonies, but it became illegal to own slaves in Holland really early. So all the slaves that have been in Holland that have been brought from Africa to Holland were freed pretty early on. In the scheme of things, I think like 1700s. And so they settled and they became families, and they passed that heritage on, usually intermarrying with Dutch people that were there. So what gets passed on is some of that, some of the genetic, and some can be darker, right? And so that's what the Black Dutch means in Holland is groups of people who are of African descent recently, right? Though there are other people, and this is what I was told when I was growing up, who would say that the Black Dutch are actually just Dutch people who are darker. But the studyings that I've done show that the Black Dutch are usually descendants of slaves. Though if you get somebody, because people with no recent African heritage in Scandinavian countries, And in like Ireland and stuff like that, absolutely can have tightly coiled hair. If you get somebody who has really tightly coiled hair without that African ancestry and that tightly coiled hair is black, they might be called Black Dutch because they have that dark hair and still don't have that African ancestry. Uh, Yet most people who are called Black Dutch is because they have recent African ancestry, and it shows in their phenotypical or their phenotype presentation. Um, and we do we tend to forget that skin tones range everywhere. Like, the top of Africa is Caucasian. The bottom of Eurasia is Caucasian. But the top of Eurasia is Nordic. And we see that the Turtle Islands go from really light skin to really dark skin. So we also see Africa going from relatively light skin to pretty dark skin. We see the same thing in like India. You can see that you go from actually really light skin to actually really dark skin in just the space of India below the mountains, the Hindu mountains, right? And so you can see that pretty much across space. You can see within Asia that you can go from in Mongolia, you can go from really light skin coming from a Nordic or not Nordic, an ice space, a very Arctic space, to being darker skin coming from maybe the middle part of Asia, because Mongolian, is such a huge range, right? So you can see that throughout these different cultures and concepts, skin tone ranges always. We like to think of skin as, like, well, you have this color skin, so it must mean that you're this. And it's really just not, because skin tone just ranges. I don't remember if it was Fiscograph or if it was BGP who did a video recently talking about that. Like, they did a live recently talking about that. I'm not as knowledgeable as they are in the alleles and the way the alleles of the skin work. I do know that the alleles for skin color, though everybody has the alleles for the majority of skin colors, and it's not people only have certain alleles, is that those certain alleles are the not maybe not okay, so everybody's DNA has the possibility to manifest all those different alleles, and only certain alleles manifest within the DNA, I guess, is probably the better way to put it. But again, this is not my specialty. It's not something I understand or explain really, or understand really. That's that's awesome. But we absolutely see that skin tone is definitely, and it's not even related as much to heritage as things like hair and eye color are. Like, eye color is, that recessive versus dominant gene, and skin color is not about recessive versus dominant genes. At least that's what I'm learning. It's something that I'm still in the process of learning because I don't understand it enough. Uh, but we absolutely see that in different spaces, we'll see a wide range of skin tone in different spaces. And it really has to do, like, they're finding out that if you're pregnant, the environment you're in will dictate your child's skin tone. Um, that There's a lot of different things. Like, we've talked about, there's possibility that light skin might actually help protect from cold. There's possibility that dark skin might actually help protect to dissipate heat. Um, you know, so these are all really about environmental factors more than they're about genetic factors. It's really all about the environment rather than the genes. That doesn't mean that genes don't come to play, right? Obviously, genes are going to come to play, or at least they appear to come into play. Uh, it does mean that it is not the determining factor as much as environmental, or that it's not the only determining factor, I guess is a better way to put that. And again, I might have said a couple of things incorrect in that, or I might be, like slightly off in it, not too off, but slightly off in it because it's not exactly my area of understanding very well. Um, so when we're looking at that in different regions, we have to understand that some regions don't look at it the same way. some regions do look at it the same way, that there's always going to be some mixture of different tones. Skin tone is always going to be a range. It's always going to be a range. And it's not ever going to be everybody, everybody looks the same on it. It just isn't meant to be. I mean, as a species, nothing about us is everybody's all the same anyways. I mean, we're so many different species in our creation. We're so many different groups of people, or species as we migrate. We're so many different groups of people. There's never that stillness. Yeah. And I've met a lot of Germanic people who are darker. Again, remember, like, so if all of Western Europe starts out as dark-haired, blue-eyed people, there's groups of people who are retaining that darker skin. We get a predominantly light population, but it doesn't mean that everybody is light in the population. It just is, this is a predominant. In certain spaces, different skin tones will actually absolutely attribute to different experiences, right? Uh, there was a video and it was shared around, and I don't remember. It was done on somebody's, like, it was, anyways. A woman was talking about, she was at the store with her sister-in-law, and her sister-in-law is a white presenting black woman. Like, she's so light that people think she's white. But she is a black woman. She grew up in a black culture. She has black parents. She's black. And the differences in treatment within, what that they saw, and how she, using her privilege that she gets from her light skin, total black woman, still privileged because of her white skin, was stepping up to help this woman. And I can't remember the video or who the video was of, but it's really indicative of how we can see that you can be a part of a culture and have a different skin tone and have a different experience. I know that my indigeneity is my indigeneity, and people shouldn't like try and tell me I'm not. And yet, as this color of an indigenous human being, I don't experience the same shit that my darker siblings do. I don't experience the same level of racism, and so I have to use this privilege to help them, right? To Not to help, that makes it sound like I'm trying to white savior my ass, but to ensure that they're acknowledged and to ensure that their voices are heard and nobody's harming them, right? So uh we see, I've talked before about having a friend who's pretty white, and had a very white husband, and they had a black daughter, and they don't have African lineage several generations back, but the child was DNA wise both of theirs, right? She's absolutely theirs, and black. The case in South Africa of Sandra Lang, where she had two white parents, and she's black. We see that there's a lot of this idea that this just doesn't happen, but it does. It just does across the board, that children can be born in a wide range of skin tones to parents from a totally different wide range of skin tones, right? um I look more like my mom, and my sister looks like my dad. It's her biological father. And now that I know my biological father, my facial features are definitely from his side of the family, but like my hair is my mother's to a T. My lips are my mother's. Um, my skin is my mother's. Hers is maybe slightly, it's hard for me to tell because of the fact that I was darker when I was younger, and I have severe issues, severe anemic issues, and not just like regular anemia, but like the ferritin based anemia, and other issues that my skin has gotten significantly lighter looking over the years. Uh, so I can't say really that she's darker than I am now, but when I was younger, I was darker than she is. Um, so you can see where, but my baby sister is like white blonde hair, and she's Scottish, and she's as Scottish as it come, right? So um I think I'm going to take off and do some other stuff. Uh, try and get my head together. Um, I just want people to remember today every group has indigeneity to a specific space. Deciding that the colonizers' ideas are looking at animistic ideas through colonizers' lenses, or deciding that colonizers of other space are closed practices, or that you have control over people, how people interact with the community that you yourself are reconnecting to, right? Is pretty white and pretty colonized thought process and pretty Christian thought process. That's not what we're supposed to be doing. For the rest of it, I want people to remember, as always, that we are all needed, that we are all worthy, that our worth is just in being here, just in existing. It is not what we are exploitable for. It is not what people can get out of us. It is that we are here and that we exist and we are contributing to the continuation as our species. That is our worth. And we are a part of that, period. Whether we're having children or not, we're still contributing to the continuation of our species. And your worth is based in that, period. When you are doing your work to try and uplift others, to try and reconnect to community, to try and make change, when you are depressed and sad in this environment that is so disconnected and feels so wrong, and so you're living your life in this sadness and you don't understand why, you are worth more. You are the needed. You are who is going to make the changes that we need to get out of this space. So when you are lost in that feeling of disconnection or that lack of worth, realize that that feeling in and of itself is what makes you worthy to the change that we need within society. And if you did not feel like the world's on fire and there needs to be change happening, then you are part of the problem and less worth. So if you are so weighed down by the trauma of the world around you, if you're capable of seeing that the world needs change and you are working towards it, then that base worth that we all have is multiplied thousands of times, because it is only in that understanding that this is fucked up and in that trying to change it that we're going to come about with change. Continue to meet the needs of community, but put your needs before others' desires. Continue to question and uplift marginalized voices, and continue to search for that connection that you're missing. Much love to everybody. Have a wonderful day. I will probably see you guys tomorrow. Yep. Bye, everybody. Nobody here. Bye.